At first, it was just a faint mist that rolled in from the outskirts of the city, softening the harsh edges of buildings and dimming the neon lights that flickered in the night. No one paid much attention. It was late October, after all, a time when the air turned damp and the seasons shifted. But by morning, the fog had thickened. Jamie Sullivan noticed it first as she stood at the bus stop, clutching her coat tightly around her. The air felt colder than usual, and the street ahead was barely visible. Cars passed slowly, their headlights cutting weakly through the dense white. It wasn't just the fog's thickness that unnerved her. It was the silence. No birds, no distant hum of traffic, no footsteps echoing along the pavement. Just an oppressive, suffocating stillness. When the bus arrived, late and nearly empty, Jamie climbed aboard, grateful for the warmth. The driver, a wiry man with tired eyes, seemed uneasy. "Strange weather, huh?" Jamie offered as she handed him her fare. He nodded curtly, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "Be careful out there," he muttered, almost as an afterthought. The bus moved slowly through the fog, the buildings on either side reduced to ghostly silhouettes. Jamie glanced out the window, her stomach tightening. At the next stop, a man in a gray suit stood waiting. He stepped forward, his figure disappearing into the mist as the bus approached. But when the doors opened, no one got on. The driver waited a moment, then shook his head and closed the doors. "Didn't he just—" Jamie started, but the driver interrupted. "Don't ask," he said sharply. Jamie sank back into her seat, her skin prickling. By the time Jamie reached her office, the fog was so dense that the building's familiar facade was barely recognizable. She hurried inside, feeling a strange sense of relief as the doors closed behind her. The office was unusually quiet. A few co-workers were huddled by the window, their faces pale as they stared outside. "What's going on?" Jamie asked, setting her bag down. "You didn't hear?" Mark, a colleague, turned to her. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "People are disappearing. Cops are everywhere." "Disappearing?" Jamie repeated, her heart racing. "What do you mean?" "They go into the fog and don't come back," Mark said. "No one knows why. It's like they're just gone." Jamie laughed nervously. "Come on, Mark. That's ridiculous." But Mark's expression didn't change. Jamie's phone buzzed, breaking the tension. She pulled it out, relieved to see her mother's name on the screen. "Hi, Mom," she said, forcing cheerfulness into her voice. "How's everything at home? Jamie, are you safe?" her mother asked, her voice trembling. "I'm fine. Why?" "The news is saying people are missing. They're telling everyone to stay inside." "Jamie, don't go out there." Jamie glanced at her coworkers, their whispered conversations and tense faces confirming her mother's words. "I'll be careful," she promised. "Don't worry." But as she hung up, a sinking feeling settled in her chest. That evening, the streets were eerily empty as Jamie walked home. The fog was thicker than ever, pressing against her like a living thing. She quickened her pace, her footsteps muffled by the dense air. Suddenly, a faint sound reached her ears, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like footsteps following her. She turned, but the street behind her was empty. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. No answer. She started walking again, faster this time. The tapping grew louder, closer, until it felt like someone was just behind her. Jamie spun around, her breath catching in her throat. A figure stood a few feet away, barely visible through the fog. It was tall and shadowy, its features obscured. "Who are you?" Jamie demanded, her voice cracking. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It simply stood there, watching. Heart pounding, Jamie turned and ran, the fog swallowing her as she fled. When Jamie finally reached her apartment, she slammed the door shut and locked it. Her chest heaved as she leaned against the door, her mind racing. Her phone buzzed again. It was a message from Mark. "Stay inside. Don't go near the fog. And whatever you do, don't follow the voices." Jamie stared at the screen, her pulse quickening. Voices? She hadn't heard any, but the thought sent a chill down her spine. Outside, the fog pressed against her windows like a living thing, swirling and shifting as if it were alive. And somewhere deep within it, something moved. The fog didn't lift the next morning. If anything, it grew thicker, denser, and somehow heavier, as though the air itself carried an unbearable weight. Jamie woke up groggy, her dreams full of shadowy figures and muffled voices she couldn't quite recall. When she pulled back her curtains, all she could see was the fog. It pressed against the window, an endless sea of white that seemed to stretch forever. The city outside was silent again, the stillness broken only by the occasional blaring of a distant siren. Jamie reached for her phone. No new messages from her coworkers, but Mark's warning from the night before was still there, staring back at her. "Don't go near the fog. And whatever you do, don't follow the voices." It felt ridiculous, voices in the fog. But her gut told her to take it seriously. Something was wrong. She could feel it in the air. Jamie had just poured herself a cup of coffee when she heard the banging. It was loud, frantic, and coming from her front door. She froze, her heart pounding. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice shaking. "It's Mrs. Carter. Please, open the door." Jamie recognized the voice immediately. Mrs. Carter was her neighbor, a sweet woman in her 60s who always smelled of lavender and baked too many cookies at Christmas. Jamie hesitated, then opened the door a crack. Mrs. Carter shoved her way in, slamming the door behind her. She was pale, her eyes wide with terror. "They took him," she gasped, clutching Jamie's arm. "What? Who took who?" "Harold. My Harold." Tears streamed down Mrs. Carter's face. "The fog. It took him. One minute he was there, and the next he was gone." Jamie led her to the couch, trying to calm her down. "Start from the beginning. What happened?" "We were watching the news," Mrs. Carter said, her voice trembling. "They were telling everyone to stay inside. Harold said he heard something outside. A voice, calling his name. He opened the door, and the fog just swallowed him." Jamie's stomach twisted. "Did you see anyone? Person?" Mrs. Carter shook her head. "No, just the fog." By noon, the city was in panic. Jamie's phone buzzed nonstop with news alerts. Missing persons reports were flooding in, and officials were urging residents to stay indoors and lock their doors. A new warning flashed on her screen. "If you hear voices calling your name, do not respond. Do not go outside." Jamie stared at the message, her hands trembling. What was happening? How could fog, just fog, be causing this? Her thoughts were interrupted by a loud crash outside. She rushed to the window and saw a car smashed into a lamppost. Its driver's side door was open, but there was no one inside. The fog swirled around the car like it was alive, creeping through the open door and wrapping itself around the empty seat. Jamie backed away from the window, her breath shallow. By evening, Jamie was pacing her apartment, her nerves frayed. Mrs. Carter had fallen asleep on the couch, clutching a picture of her husband. Jamie couldn't sit still anymore. She needed answers. Why was this happening? Where were the missing people? Against her better judgment, she grabbed her coat and slipped outside. The air was cold and damp, the fog wrapping around her like a second skin. She stayed close to the building, her footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. The streets were deserted. Cars sat abandoned, their headlights dimmed. Shops were dark, their doors locked tight. The city felt like a ghost town, swallowed by the fog. Jamie reached the corner and stopped. A faint sound reached her ears, soft and distant, like a whisper. Jamie, her blood turned to ice. The voice was faint but unmistakable. Someone was calling her name. Jamie. It came from somewhere deep in the fog, soft and beckoning. Jamie's instincts screamed at her to run, to get back inside, but her feet wouldn't move. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice shaky. The whisper didn't answer. Instead, it grew louder, closer. Jamie, her legs finally obeyed, and she stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the curb. She turned and sprinted back to her building, slamming the door behind her. Mrs. Carter woke with a start. "What happened? Where did you go?" Jamie leaned against the door, trying to catch her breath. I heard it. The voice. It was calling my name." Mrs. Carter's face went pale. "You didn't answer, did you?" Jamie shook her head. "No, but it was so close." The next day, the city was in full lockdown. Police barricades blocked the major roads, and emergency broadcasts played on repeat. "Stay indoors. Do not respond to voices outside. The situation is under investigation." But the fog only grew thicker, and the disappearances continued. Entire families vanished from their homes. The few people who ventured outside didn't come back. Jamie and Mrs. Carter sat by the window, watching the swirling fog. Felt alive, moving with a purpose. "Do you think Harold is still out there?" Mrs. Carter asked quietly. Jamie didn't know how to answer. She didn't want to lie, but the truth was too horrifying to say out loud. That night, Jamie was woken by a strange sound. It wasn't the whispering this time, it was tapping. She sat up, her heart pounding. The sound was coming from her window. Slowly, she got out of bed and approached the glass. A handprint appeared on the fogged-up pane, clear and distinct. Jamie froze, staring at it. Then, letters began to form beneath the handprint, as if someone was writing in the fog. "Help!" Jamie's breath hitched. She reached out, her fingers hovering over the glass. "Jamie!" The whisper was back, louder this time, and coming from right outside her window. She stumbled backward, her mind racing. The handprint and the word were still there, but the whispering was growing louder, more insistent. "Jamie!" She bolted for the living room, waking Mrs. Carter. "There's something at my window," she gasped. Mrs. Carter's eyes widened. "We need to leave. We can't stay here." The night felt longer than any Jamie had ever known. The eerie quiet outside her apartment was suffocating. The fog pressed against the windows like a living thing, and the voices, faint but undeniable, continued to whisper just beyond the glass. Mrs. Carter's eyes were wide with fear, her hands shaking as she clutched the picture of her husband. "I don't want to be here anymore," she whispered. "I can't stay." Jamie didn't know what to say. She couldn't even reassure herself, let alone Mrs. Carter. Everything felt wrong. I think we need to leave," Jamie said, her voice barely audible. Mrs. Carter nodded, her eyes filled with both fear and desperation. She reached for her purse, her hands trembling as she fumbled through it. Jamie felt the weight of the decision hanging between them. Was it even safe outside? Would they be swallowed up by the fog, just like the others? The city was quieter than ever when they stepped out. The streets, usually bustling with people at night, were completely empty. Every building seemed to be locked tight, every light turned off. It was as if the world had disappeared, leaving only the fog. Jamie could barely see her own hand in front of her face as they walked down the darkened street, the mist curling around their feet. The air was thick and damp, and the world felt distant, muffled, as if they were walking in a dream. "Stay close," Jamie whispered to Mrs. Carter, who was walking behind her, every step uncertain. They moved cautiously, unsure of which direction to go. The city felt foreign, its familiar streets now strange and threatening. Out of the corner of her eye, Jamie thought she saw something, a shadow moving quickly in the distance. She froze, squinting into the fog. But when she looked closer, it was gone. "Did you see that?" Jamie whispered, turning to Mrs. Carter. Mrs. Carter nodded, her face pale. "Yes, but I don't know what it was." The feeling of being watched intensified. Jamie could feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. It wasn't just the fog or the silence. It was the sense that something was lurking just beyond the mist, something waiting to strike. Suddenly, there was a sound, a faint rustling, like leaves brushing against the ground. Jamie turned quickly, her heart racing, but there was nothing there. The fog swallowed the sound almost as soon as it had appeared, leaving them in eerie stillness. "Keep moving," Jamie said, her voice steady but tense. "We need to find somewhere safe." As they walked, the fog grew thicker, almost suffocating. The temperature dropped, and Jamie's breath came out in visible puffs. They had been walking for what felt like hours, but the city was still silent, as though frozen in time. Then Jamie heard it. "Jamie," it was soft at first, just a whisper, but it grew louder. It was unmistakable. "Jamie," the voice sounded so familiar, but how could it be? She couldn't remember hearing it before, but it felt as though it was someone she knew, someone close. "Jamie," she stopped dead in her tracks, looking around in panic. Mrs. Carter was right behind her, her face filled with confusion. "What is it? Who's calling your name?" "I don't know." Jamie's voice trembled as she turned in a slow circle. The fog seemed to swirl around them, closing in like a trap. "I thought I heard someone familiar." Another voice echoed, this one male, low and commanding. "Jamie," it was so close now, almost within reach. "Don't listen," Mrs. Carter whispered urgently. "Don't answer. It's the fog. It's pulling you in." But it was already too late. Jamie took a hesitant step forward, the voice drawing her in, a magnetic pull she couldn't explain. She glanced back at Mrs. Carter, but the older woman seemed paralyzed with fear, unable to speak. "Jamie," the voice was now behind her, just beyond the veil of mist. Without thinking, Jamie stepped forward, drawn toward the sound. She could feel the fog pressing in, thick and suffocating. It wasn't just cold now, it was unnatural, alive, and pressing in from all sides. The darkness closed in around her, and the voice seemed to surround her. "Jamie," the world around Jamie shifted. She felt disoriented, dizzy, as though the ground beneath her feet was no longer solid. She reached out for support, but her hands brushed against something cold and wet, not the familiar streets of her city. The voice was louder now, but it wasn't the same anymore. It sounded almost distorted, as if it were coming from deep within the earth itself. "Jamie," suddenly Jamie snapped out of her trance. She took a step back, her head spinning. What had just happened? She felt as though she had lost time, as if a part of her had wandered into the fog and never returned. But when she turned around, Mrs. Carter was gone. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. "Mrs. Carter?" she called out, her voice shaking. "Where are you?" There was no response. The fog thickened, swallowing her words as if they had never been spoken. "Mrs. Carter," but she was alone. Jamie's breath came out in ragged gasps as she stepped forward, calling her neighbor's name over and over. She spun in a circle, searching the fog for any sign of the woman. But the world around her remained eerily silent. The fog seemed to grow thicker, more oppressive with every passing moment. Her hands shook as she fumbled for her phone, but there was no signal. "Where are you, Mrs. Carter?" Jamie whispered to herself. "Where did you go?" The city had vanished. The streets, the buildings, everything that had once been familiar was gone. She was standing in an empty void, swallowed by the fog. And then, out of the silence, she heard it again. "Jamie," but this time the voice wasn't calling her. It was laughing, a chilling, distorted laugh that echoed through the fog. Suddenly, a shape appeared in the distance. Jamie's heart stopped. The figure was tall and indistinct, a silhouette against the fog. It was moving slowly toward her, its form shifting, as if it couldn't decide whether it wanted to be human or something else. "Who's there?" Jamie called out, her voice trembling. The figure stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, the laughter echoed again, sending a chill down her spine. "Jamie," the voice called again, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It was mocking, distorted. "Stay away from me," Jamie shouted, backing away, but the figure started moving toward her again, slowly, purposefully. The fog seemed to follow it, growing thicker with each step the figure took. "Jamie," and then the figure spoke in a voice Jamie recognized all too well. "Jamie, it's me." Jamie's breath caught in her throat as the figure stepped closer. The voice that had once felt so familiar now sent a cold shiver down her spine. "It's me," the figure repeated, its voice now clear and unmistakable. She could barely make out the face. The fog had distorted everything, but the eyes were the same. Dark, hollow, and staring straight through her. But it couldn't be him. Her heart raced as she took a step back, the figure following her every movement. "No," Jamie whispered to herself. "No, you're not him." The figure smiled, a cruel, twisted grin spreading across its face. It was mocking her, and she could feel it, deep down in her bones. "I'm exactly who you think I am," it said, its voice now dripping with malice. Jamie's mind raced. How could this be happening? The man she once knew, the man she'd loved, he was gone. Dead. He died months ago. But this thing in front of her, with his face, was something else entirely. "You're not real," Jamie said, her voice barely above a whisper, trembling. The figure took another step closer, its form shifting again, its edges blurring in the fog. "Oh, I'm very real, Jamie," it said, its voice low and haunting. "And I've been waiting for you." Jamie's legs felt weak beneath her. She couldn't breathe. The fog was closing in, pressing down on her chest, and the figure's laughter echoed in her mind. It felt like the walls were closing in, the very air thickening with each passing second. She spun around, looking for an escape, but there was none. The city, or what was left of it, had disappeared. The streetlights were gone. The buildings, the roads, nothing. It was just an endless sea of fog. She was trapped. "Please," Jamie whispered, her voice breaking. "Please, just leave me alone." But the figure didn't leave. It stepped closer, and Jamie stumbled back, her heart pounding in her ears. The figure's laughter grew louder, filling her head, drowning out everything else. "You're not going anywhere, Jamie," the figure said. "You never were." Jamie turned, her eyes desperately searching for some sign of the city, any sign of safety. But there was nothing, only the fog, thick, oppressive, and suffocating. The world had disappeared. She could still hear the figure's voice behind her, could feel its presence looming in the mist. Every step she took, it was right there, as though it were walking alongside her, watching her every move. "Stop," Jamie begged, her voice breaking. "Stop following me." But the voice didn't stop. It grew louder. "Jamie," she stumbled forward, her eyes wide, every nerve in her body on edge. She needed to get out of there, needed to escape, but no matter how fast she moved, the fog seemed to follow her, swirling around her feet, pulling her back. She could feel it now, something cold, something sharp, brushing against her skin. Was it the fog, or was it something else? Her heart raced as she spun around, looking for anything that might give her a hint of where she was. But all she saw was the endless white. Jamie, the voice was closer now, so close. She whirled around, her breath coming out in quick, panicked gasps. But this time there was no figure. There was nothing at all. She stopped, her pulse pounding in her ears. "Hello," she called out, her voice barely a whisper. No answer. The fog pressed in on her, heavier than ever. She felt her knees weaken. Was she going mad? Or was this real? "Mrs. Carter," Jamie whispered. But there was no response. No sound. Only the fog. She was alone. Then suddenly the voice was there again. "Jamie." This time the voice didn't sound familiar. It was raw, full of pain, as though someone was calling out from the depths of despair. She spun around, her eyes wide with terror. "Who's there?" The voice laughed. A low, gurgling laugh that seemed to come from nowhere, bouncing off the fog in every direction. "You shouldn't have come here, Jamie," the voice said, its tone dripping with malice. "I had to," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "I had no choice." But the fog seemed to answer. It swirled around her, thick and dark, pressing in from all sides. She couldn't breathe. The air was heavy, suffocating. The voice laughed again, sending a chill down her spine. "Oh, you had a choice, Jamie. You just didn't see it." Then, in the distance, Jamie saw movement. It was small at first, just a flicker, but it was there. Something or someone was moving through the fog. Her heart leapt in her chest. She ran toward it, her feet slipping against the wet ground. As she got closer, the shape became clearer. It was a person, a woman. "Mrs. Carter?" Jamie shouted, relief flooding through her as she neared the figure. The woman turned slowly. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow and empty, like she was lost, trapped in the fog just like Jamie. But when she spoke, it wasn't Mrs. Carter's voice. "Why did you come here?" the woman asked in a voice that sent ice through Jamie's veins. I'm looking for someone," Jamie stammered, her heart pounding in her chest. The woman stepped closer, her eyes never leaving Jamie's. "You should leave before it's too late." "What do you mean?" Jamie asked, her voice shaking. The woman took a step back, disappearing into the fog before Jamie could ask anything more. But her words lingered in the air. "Before it's too late." Jamie stood frozen in place, her mind racing. The fog was closing in again, thick and oppressive. But this time she didn't feel the same fear. She had to know what was happening. What was this place? And why was it so determined to keep her here? She looked around, trying to gather her thoughts. The air felt heavier now, thicker with the presence of something malevolent. It was as though the fog itself was alive, watching, waiting. And then she saw it. A shadow in the distance. But this time it wasn't just a shadow. It was a figure standing tall against the fog. The outline was unmistakable. It was the same figure she had seen before. It was coming closer again. "No," Jamie whispered. "I won't let you." She turned and began to run. But no matter how fast she moved, the figure seemed to get closer. It was gaining on her, its shape becoming clearer, its features more defined. Jamie stumbled, her foot catching on something, and she fell to the ground. She could hear the figure's footsteps now, each one echoing in the fog. She scrambled to her feet, but the figure was almost upon her. "Jamie?" She froze, her heart pounding. The voice was right behind her. "Jamie?" The voice was so close now, she could almost feel the breath on the back of her neck. But when she turned around, there was no one there. The fog was empty again. And for the first time since she'd stepped into the fog, Jamie didn't feel alone. The fog was everywhere, thick and suffocating. It clung to Jamie's skin, crawling into her lungs, making it harder to breathe. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was following her, watching her every move, waiting for her to make a mistake. She looked around again, her heart pounding in her chest. The fog seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. No sign of the streetlights, no familiar buildings, just this never-ending white blur. She wasn't sure how much longer she could keep going. Her body ached from the cold, and the air was so heavy it felt like it was pressing in on her chest. Every step felt like it took more effort than the last. She had to find a way out. There had to be an escape from this nightmare. But then she heard it again. A sound, faint at first but growing louder. The unmistakable shuffle of footsteps. Jamie froze. She had been running through the fog, her mind frantic. But now she stood still, straining her ears to listen. The footsteps were getting closer, slower than before, like they were deliberately dragging, taking their time. It wasn't just one set of footsteps. It was more, a whole group, coming toward her from all directions. Her eyes darted around, but there was nothing to see in the thick fog. No shape, no movement, just the endless white and the growing sense of dread. The footsteps were now directly behind her. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, her skin prickling with fear. "Who's there?" Jamie called out, her voice shaky. She didn't want to hear a response, but she couldn't stop herself. Her body trembled from the weight of the silence that followed her words. The footsteps stopped. Jamie's heart pounded in her chest. The fog pressed in tighter around her, making her feel as if she were being smothered. She took a step back, her mind racing. Whatever was out there, it wasn't going to let her go. She had to keep moving. But as she took another step, a voice broke the silence. "Help me!" The voice was soft at first, barely a whisper, but it sounded desperate. Jamie's eyes snapped toward the direction the voice came from, but all she saw was more fog. She took another step toward it, feeling an overwhelming pull, as though something was drawing her in. "Who's there?" she whispered, barely able to speak, her throat tight with fear. "Please, help me." The voice was coming from somewhere ahead, but Jamie couldn't see anything. She hesitated, the fear clawing at her stomach. She didn't want to move forward, but she couldn't stop herself. Her legs carried her forward, and the fog seemed to part just enough to allow her to see a figure ahead, barely visible. It was a person, standing there in the fog, their face obscured by the mist. But their posture was wrong. Something about it felt off. They were hunched over, as if they were struggling to stay upright. Jamie's breath hitched. The person wasn't moving. "Are you okay?" Jamie asked, her voice trembling. She wanted to run, but something kept her rooted in place. The figure slowly turned to face her. The mist swirled around them, creating an eerie, almost otherworldly effect. The person's face was now visible, but something about it made Jamie's blood run cold. It was a woman, but her eyes were wide and vacant, staring at Jamie without recognition. Her skin was pale, almost gray, and her lips trembled as though she was on the verge of speaking. The woman's hands were outstretched, reaching toward Jamie, but she didn't seem to notice. "Help me," the woman whispered again, her voice strained, almost pleading. Jamie took a step back, her pulse racing. She didn't know what to do. She wanted to help, but the sight of the woman, standing there so lifeless, unnerved her. Something about her seemed wrong, like she was part of the fog itself. The woman's outstretched hands were trembling more now, and her eyes started to flicker, as though she were slowly becoming aware of Jamie's presence. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished back into the fog. Jamie blinked, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. She hadn't imagined it. She had seen her, the woman, and yet, in an instant, she was gone. She felt her heart racing, a sense of panic gripping her chest. The fog was closing in again, heavier than before. It felt like the mist was alive, smothering her, dragging her deeper into its cold embrace. She couldn't stay here. She had to keep moving. The mist was thick, almost suffocating now. The distant echo of footsteps returned, but this time, it wasn't the same. It was heavier, more deliberate. The sound was drawing closer, like something or someone was following her. Jamie's breath quickened. She glanced over her shoulder but couldn't see anything in the fog. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until it felt like they were right behind her. She spun around again, fear creeping up her spine. Nothing. The fog, the silence. But she knew it was there. She could feel it. "Who's there?" she shouted, the words sharp in the quiet, her voice trembling in the eerie stillness. The fog seemed to answer. A low growl echoed through the mist, sending a wave of terror crashing through Jamie's chest. It was animalistic, guttural, as if the fog itself was alive, hungry. Her eyes widened, her pulse racing. She had no idea what was out there, but she had to get away from it. She ran. The fog seemed to grow heavier, thicker, as though it was pushing back against her, trying to pull her down. Every step she took felt like it was dragging her deeper into the mist. The sounds of growling grew louder, more desperate. "Please," Jamie gasped, her breath coming in ragged bursts. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, thumping louder than the growls in the distance. "Please, I need to get out." The growls came closer. She wasn't alone anymore. Jamie stumbled forward, feeling a cold pressure building around her chest, tightening with each step. It was as if something was watching her, waiting to pounce. The air seemed to hum with it, the sense of something unseen just beyond the veil of fog. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw something moving. It was quick, fleeting, a shadow darting between the swirling mists. But it was enough to send a jolt of terror through her veins. "Who's there?" Jamie demanded again, her voice barely above a whisper, but it was no use. The growling stopped, the fog thickened, and then the fog parted for just a moment, revealing a dark shape standing in the distance. A figure. A man? Jamie's breath caught in her throat. He stood motionless, facing her. Then the fog closed in again, swallowing him whole. Jamie's heart hammered in her chest as she watched the fog close in around her, swallowing the dark figure. Her mind screamed at her to run, to escape, but her body felt frozen. Something about that man, no, whatever he was, had sent a chill straight to her bones. She blinked, trying to focus, but the fog was dense now, thick like a living thing, pressing in from all sides. Her breathing came in shallow gasps. Her thoughts were scattered, the fear overwhelming. What was happening? Her mind raced, but she couldn't make sense of it. The fog seemed to pulse, almost as if it were breathing. Each time she took a step, the air felt heavier, colder, and those footsteps, they were still out there. She could feel them. But it wasn't just the footsteps anymore. There was something else, something darker. The whispers started again, soft and distant at first, but growing louder with each passing second. "Help me, please." It wasn't the woman's voice anymore. This was different, hollow, echoing in the fog. It felt as though the very mist itself was speaking. Jamie's legs felt weak, but she forced herself to keep moving, to follow the voice, the whispers that beckoned her deeper into the fog. She had to know what was going on. She couldn't just stand there. She couldn't stay still. The sound of her footsteps was all she could hear now, each one muffled by the thick fog. And then, there it was again, a figure, not far in front of her, standing still, barely visible through the mist. Jamie's heart skipped a beat. She froze, her blood running cold. The figure was not moving, just standing there, waiting. "Who are you?" Jamie called out, her voice shaking. There was no response. Her pulse quickened. She took a tentative step forward, but the figure didn't move. The air felt charged, crackling with an energy she couldn't explain. Every fiber in her being screamed for her to turn around, to flee, but she didn't. She couldn't. The voice, the whispers, pulled her closer. She stepped forward again, and this time, the figure turned. It was the man from earlier. Or was it? She couldn't be sure. The fog made it hard to see clearly, but she could feel his eyes on her, watching, waiting. He didn't speak. He just stared, his gaze unblinking. Jamie's stomach twisted. There was something wrong with him. Something off. The man took a step toward her. She gasped and took a step back. "No, stay back," she shouted, her voice now rising in panic. But the man didn't stop. His movements were slow, deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. "Please," Jamie whispered, her voice barely audible. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew one thing. She was in danger. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs wouldn't move. It was as if the fog itself had trapped her, wrapping around her like invisible chains, holding her in place. The man was getting closer, and with each step, the air grew colder, denser. Jamie's breath came out in shaky clouds, and her hands trembled as she clutched at the fabric of her jacket. She had to do something. She had to get out. And then, in an instant, the man stopped. Just a few feet away, he stood completely still, his head tilted slightly, as if studying her. Jamie held her breath. Every second felt like an eternity. The fog had grown so thick now that she could barely see beyond the tips of her own fingers. What does he want? Without warning, the man raised his arm, pointing a finger at her. His hand was unnaturally long, the fingers stretching out like skeletal limbs. "No, no, no, no. Run," the man's voice came, but it was not the same voice she had heard before. It was cold, empty, a mere echo. "Run now." Jamie didn't need to be told twice. She turned and ran. Her feet stumbled over the uneven ground, the fog closing in behind her like a wall, swallowing up every trace of her path. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her lungs burning as the mist clung to her skin, dragging her down. She could hear the footsteps now, not just behind her but all around her, closing in, following her. The whispers grew louder, closer. More voices joined in, their pleas becoming a chorus of desperation. "Help! Please! Don't leave me here." Jamie's mind spun, her body moving on instinct, her feet pounding the ground. She couldn't stop. The fog was relentless, the figures, the whispers. They were all closing in, taking over her reality. Every turn she made only led her deeper into the mist. Her pulse thudded in her ears, deafening. The fog seemed alive, its cold fingers reaching out, pulling at her, dragging her down into its depths. "Where are you?" she shouted, her voice cracking with panic. "What do you want from me?" But there was no answer. Only the fog. Only the growling, the whispers, and the footsteps. She kept running, but the fog was getting denser, thicker. The ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, the path twisting, warping in ways she couldn't explain. The world around her seemed to be unraveling. And then, without warning, her foot caught on something. She stumbled, falling forward into the mist. The ground beneath her hands was cold, damp. She scrambled to get up, her heart racing. But as she lifted her head, she saw it. A door. It was just standing there, in the middle of the fog. The frame was old, weathered, but there was something about it, something unnatural. Without thinking, Jamie reached for the door handle and yanked it open. A rush of cold air hit her in the face, but beyond the door was nothing, just darkness. But the moment she stepped through, the fog behind her vanished. Jamie's fingers trembled as she gripped the door handle, her pulse racing. She had no idea where it would lead, but the fog, the shadows, the whispers, they were too much. She had to escape. She had to find a way out of the nightmare. She stepped through the door. The air was cold, a biting chill that seemed to freeze her very soul. For a moment, everything felt strangely still, as though time itself had stopped. Her eyes adjusted to the darkness, and she saw nothing but blackness stretching out before her. But then footsteps. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sound was faint at first, but growing louder, closer. A heavy, deliberate step. Another, and another. Jamie's heart thundered in her chest. She spun around, her hands reaching for the door, but it was gone. The space she had entered was empty, swallowed by the darkness. There was no way back. The footsteps grew louder, closer still. She was being followed, she could feel it. Something was there, and then she saw it. A shadow, tall and thin, moving just beyond her reach. It was barely visible, but there was something unmistakably wrong about it. A figure towering, its movements slow, calculated, as if it were waiting for her. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. The whispers, the voices, they were here too. "Please," Jamie whispered, her voice shaking. "What do you want from me?" But there was no response. The figure just kept moving, and it was closer now. The footsteps were like thunder in her ears. What was it? The shadow moved closer still, the air growing colder as it did. She could feel its presence, thick with malice, as if the very air was closing in around her. Without thinking, Jamie spun on her heel and started running. Her feet pounded against the cold, unseen ground, and the darkness pressed in on all sides, closing off every escape. She didn't know where she was going. All she could do was run. The footsteps, though, they followed her. Every turn, every frantic step, they were always there, always behind her. She could feel them. The darkness was alive, reaching out, pulling at her, suffocating her. It was like the walls themselves were closing in. "Why won't you leave me alone?" Jamie screamed, her voice raw. The whispers grew louder. They weren't just voices anymore. It was like the very darkness around her had become the voices, like it was speaking, growing louder with every step. "Help me, please, let me out." She couldn't breathe. The air was thick, heavy, and her chest felt tight as though the very darkness was pressing on her lungs. The shadow was closer now. She could see its form, tall, featureless, just a mass of shifting darkness. The shape was distorted, unnatural. And then it spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." Jamie's blood ran cold. The voice wasn't the same as before. It was different now, distorted, like 1,000 voices speaking in unison. It filled her ears, echoed in her mind, rattled her very bones. "You should have stayed away. This place, it doesn't let go." Jamie's heart slammed against her ribs as the shadow stepped closer, its presence overwhelming. She wanted to run, but her legs felt like lead. Her breath came in ragged gasps, the weight of the dark force around her too much to bear. "You are part of it now," the voice whispered, cold and final. "There's no going back. Terror surged through her veins, but she couldn't move. The fog had been bad, but this was worse. The suffocating darkness, the strange shadow that was closing in on her, had her paralyzed, as though the air itself was a prison. It's too late. The voice was inside her now, filling her thoughts, twisting them, taking over. She was losing herself. She couldn't fight it anymore. There was no escape. The darkness was consuming her. Jamie's mind spun, but then she heard it. A sound. A faint click, like something opening somewhere in the distance. It was enough to break her out of her trance. Move, Jamie, move. With all the strength she had left, she turned and bolted into the darkness. The footsteps followed her, closer now. Her heart pounded harder, each beat a warning, a reminder that she was running out of time. The sound of the door clicking, opening again, was louder now. She could almost feel it, the way out. She ran towards the sound, not thinking, just desperate for escape. The air around her seemed to thicken, heavier with each breath. She stumbled, falling to her knees, but she didn't stop. Her hands scrambled over the floor, pushing her forward. And then, with a sudden crash, she found it. A door. The door that had been there before, the one that led into the darkness. Without a second thought, she shoved it open, stumbling through. For a moment, there was nothing. The sound of her ragged breathing was all she could hear. And then, slowly, she looked up. She was standing in the middle of the city, the fog still swirling around her. But this time it was different. The streets were empty. The lights were dim, flickering as though they were on the verge of going out completely. The figures, the ones who had vanished, they were all around her. Their faces were blank, hollow, lifeless. They walked, but their eyes were empty, staring straight ahead, their movements stiff and unnatural. Jamie's legs buckled beneath her, and she collapsed to the ground, breathing heavily. She looked around, confused, terrified. This wasn't right. It wasn't the same place. The world had shifted, but there was something else. The man, the figure from earlier, he was there, standing in the middle of the street, staring at her with those cold, empty eyes. And his voice echoed in her mind. "You belong here now." Jamie's mind raced. The fog had swallowed her city, and now it was swallowing her life, piece by piece. The air felt heavy, thick with dread. The man, the one who had been nothing but a shadow before, was now standing before her, his eyes lifeless and cold. She could feel his gaze, like a weight pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. Her breath came in shallow gasps. The world around her, this world, was wrong. The city she once knew had become a nightmare. The people, the buildings, the streets, they were all distorted, as if something deep inside the earth had cracked open and spilled out a twisted version of reality. Jamie's hands shook as she pushed herself to her feet, her knees weak beneath her. The figure, the man with the empty eyes, took a slow step toward her. Each movement was deliberate, calculated, as if he knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't human. He wasn't even a shadow anymore. He was something far worse. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. It was like her voice had been stolen, leaving her powerless, trapped in her own body. The man took another step, his presence growing heavier, suffocating her. He didn't need to say a word. His mere existence was enough to drain her of everything she had left. She wanted to run, to escape, but the fog, the thick, choking fog, was everywhere. There was no place to hide, no place to go. "You can't escape," the man's voice broke through the silence. It was deep, distorted, like 1,000 voices speaking at once. His words crawled into her mind, filling every corner with terror. "This place doesn't let go. Jamie's heart pounded. She stumbled backward, her eyes darting around for any sign of hope, any way out. But there was nothing. The fog had swallowed it all. The city was nothing but an empty shell. She turned and ran. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get away. Her footsteps echoed through the empty streets, the sound swallowed by the thick mist. The man's voice followed her, getting louder, closer. "You belong here now," he said, each word sending a chill down her spine. "You are one of us." "No." She pushed harder, her lungs burning as she fought to escape the oppressive air. Her feet carried her through the fog, but it felt like she was running in place. The world around her twisted and bent, like the city itself was alive, mocking her every step. And then, as if by some cruel twist of fate, she stumbled into a familiar place. The old apartment building. The one she had seen in the distance, the one she had tried to avoid. But now it was right in front of her. The fog had brought her here, and she didn't know why. She hesitated for a moment, but the man's presence loomed closer. She had no choice. She ran inside. The apartment building was dark, the air thick with dust and decay. It was like stepping into a memory, a place she had long forgotten. The walls were cracked, the windows shattered. It was a place that had once been filled with life, but now it was nothing more than a shell of what it had been. Jamie moved quickly, her footsteps soft on the broken floorboards. She tried to find a way out, but the building seemed to stretch endlessly, twisting and turning, as though it was alive. Every hallway she entered led to another, darker one, and every door she opened only led to more darkness. Her heart pounded in her chest. She felt like she was being watched. The shadows around her seemed to move, whispering her name in a language she couldn't understand. The floor beneath her feet creaked with each step, groaning as if the building itself was alive, waking up from a long, forgotten slumber. And then she saw it. At the end of the hallway, through the fog and shadows, was a door. It wasn't like the others. This door seemed familiar. It had the same worn handle, the same faded paint. The same door she had walked through when she first entered the city, the door that had started this nightmare. Her breath caught in her throat. This was it, the door to the unknown. The one place that could either save her or trap her forever. Jamie didn't hesitate. She reached for the handle, but as her fingers touched it, a cold, clammy sensation ran through her body, like someone else's hand had just gripped it. Her breath caught in her throat. She pulled the door open. What she saw on the other side made her blood run cold. It wasn't the city. It wasn't the apartment building. It was something else entirely. A vast, empty void. A place where time didn't exist. The air was thick and oppressive, swirling with shadows and whispers. And standing in the center of the void was the man. The figure with the cold, empty eyes. He was no longer just a shadow. He was alive, and his eyes were locked on her. "You can't escape," he repeated, his voice like 1,000 nails scraping against a chalkboard. "You're part of it now." Jamie's mind spun. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. She had to be dreaming, but the terror was too real. The pain, the fear, the helplessness. It was all too real. "No, no," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding in her ears. "You are here because you belong here," the man said, his voice now a low, rumbling growl. "This place is your home." The shadows around him began to move, reaching out like tendrils, pulling Jamie into the void. She screamed, trying to fight back, but the darkness was everywhere, suffocating her, consuming her. And just as the shadows closed in around her, she heard a voice, a familiar voice, calling her name. "Jamie, Jamie." She stopped. The voice wasn't the man's. It wasn't the fog's whispers. It was Someone else. Someone she knew. "Jamie!" The voice shouted again, louder now. With all the strength she had left, Jamie turned, looking back through the door. It was her mother, standing there, bathed in light, her face filled with warmth. "Jamie, come back." For a moment, Jamie hesitated, torn between the darkness and the light. But as the shadows crept closer, she knew what she had to do. With a final, desperate cry, she ran toward the light. And as the darkness closed in, she stepped through the door.